Great. Well, yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. It's been great, and I just want to start off with starting with a poll, a little poll I created, which I'm going to launch now. So hopefully you should see it. So if you can just take the time really quickly, I'd just be very interested to know a bit more about you and a bit more about how you use images and your experience of using images. So I am going to launch the poll now, and hopefully everyone can see it. And yeah, just take your time to answer these questions. Just two questions. The two questions were, the first one, how often have you been using images in the classroom so far? And I guess I'm pleased to see that 0% of people who came today said never. So everyone's used them at least a bit. From time to time was 36%, and frequently is 46% with the highest result there, and then 18% with all the time. So it's good to see that that you've been using images in the classroom. Like everyone's been using images in the classroom. That's fantastic. And how likely are you to use the Atkinson Keyword Method with your students in the future? Some 8% are definitely not going to use it, and that's fine. We all have our own teaching context, and we know what works best for our students. And that is important to be able to assert that if we feel confident in that. 36% said you might, or you'll think about it. 26% said probably, if you get the chance, and 31% said definitely. So yeah, quite a strong turnout there. I can understand that for a lot of people, teaching context is really important. And I know that a lot of you are probably under a lot of time restraint and probably like institutional restraint as well, that, you know, you have a syllabus that has to be kind of followed, and there might not be space to be able to sort of bring this into your classroom. I can imagine that being a tricky obstacle for using something like this. I want to ask you a few questions, a few reflective questions after watching this workshop and basically finding out all about the keyword method and all about different ways you can use images in the classroom. Okay, if anyone has any sort of insights or questions about those, I'll give you some time to think about that as well. But yeah, the three questions. Do you use images in the class? What kind of images? How do you try to make your lessons more enjoyable? And when do you think it might not be useful to use images in the classroom? Now, I'd like to go to the question and answer window while you're still thinking about those questions. Two questions, both from Bartolo. One of them isn't a question, but I'd still like to deal with it. I'm going to hit the answer live button. So yeah, Bartolo asks or says, as a foreigner, I always had trouble to remember the difference between Tuesday and Thursday. I had to name all of the days of the week before being sure. Then everything suddenly changed when I saw a vending machine with a big picture of a drink on it and the claim thirst. So I realized that Thursday is the day that you are thirsty and you're allowed to drink, while on Tuesday, you're not feeling thirsty. So not a question, but I really wanted to deal with this because it's a really good observation, isn't it? So Thirsty Thursdays. I don't know if you've heard of this before, but Thirsty Thursdays is actually a promotional thing that some cafes and bars actually have to try and get people to come to their establishments on Thursdays instead of Fridays and Saturdays. So that's actually already used. And I think this is a really good example because I don't know so much about other English-speaking countries, but in the United Kingdom, these sorts of jokes and puns and plays on words are really, really common in advertising. So we can actually pick up a lot of ideas for keywords from just looking around. If you find yourself in places like the UK and seeing the advertising there, because it's a strong one. I'd also like to answer the second question from the question and answer session. Do you use software to draw or just pen and paper? personally, I just use pen and paper, but sometimes, I don't know, I guess I'm a bit old fashioned. And I don't have a tablet. So, so that's probably the main reason why I use pen and paper. And I just really like pens, because pens are amazing. They're just the best things ever. But that's just a personal thing. I think that doesn't mean that everyone should use pens and paper. It's all down to what you feel most comfortable with, and also what works best in your teaching context. There are all sorts of factors that would influence whether you use a pen or whether you use technology to do images. If you've got a smartboard, there probably is already quite a strong argument for using that, for example. Yeah, like I said on the outro to the workshop, it doesn't matter really how you do it. It's the ideas that are important, because that's what's going to influence the students and help them remember. Cool. Okay, so I guess I'm ready to open up to more questions. So yeah, question 1. Do you use images in the class, and what kind of images do you use? And I see that already I use doodling and sketchnoting. Yep, me too. My images, as you've seen, are very, very quick. Yes, we also have, I use images when preparing for a speaking task. Images can be photos, magazines, and newspapers. Yes, of course. A great way to prepare students for any sort of exercise is by inspiring them or getting them used to topics using images to introduce the topic. Okay, I'll move on to the next one. So it's from Gabby, and she's saying images are always useful. Can't think of when images should not be used in the classroom. Well, yes, I agree completely. It's a good question, though. There may be times when it may not work. But generally speaking, I would totally agree that if you can use an image, if the opportunity is there, I would take it straight away. Okay. Are there any more answers? I'm trying to look for the first question. Do you use images in class? Yes, we do. We have from Izivani, personal photos, Pinterest magazines, colorful and eye-catching. They stimulate conversation. Students point and ask to repeat the names of the things in the pictures. Would you be able to elaborate on that a little bit, Izivani?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I find that when I did food, for example, and I put up this big picture of different meals like the English breakfast, they would look it up on the big screen, and they would point to the different types of foods, asking to repeat, giving me the opportunity to correct their pronunciation. And then they would compare this type of breakfast to what they eat, and then we put another picture up. So they would learn lots of words, learn the correct pronunciation, actually see them so that they are able to reproduce them. And this work, many other things, especially objects around the house, things that they use to study. So I found it very practical and stimulating.
That's great. So this is a sort of way of using images to introduce vocabulary and introduce topics.
Yes.
And can I ask you very quickly about your teaching context? Do you have large classes, small classes, young learners, adults?
I teach mostly adults, and the classes are around from about 6 to a maximum of 10. But I do smaller groups of kids around the age of 10, and I usually like to keep the group down to a maximum of 4.
That's
and
wise.
With kids, I tend to use a lot of flashcards where you have the words written on the other side so they can flip them around, or memory games where they're able to sort of play games in pairs, where they look at the image, and if they don't get it right, like if they remember the word but not with the correct pronunciation, I don't give them the point. So they play again and again, and they compete with each other. And if I do it with just words, without the image, I've tried that, and it doesn't work because they don't know what it means.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Because, yeah, I suppose we associate meaning with what things look like, especially when it comes to like objects and nouns.
Mm-hmm.
I have one more question very quickly. Do you find that images work better with children or adults, or does everyone respond to them in your experience?
No, I think it works well across the board. I
Mm.
mean, I've worked with engineers in the steel industry and teaching them about the production process, and it's so complicated, the plant. But if you take a picture and you label it and you explain each part of the process to them, they may not be able to explain the process, but they're able to remember the words and the function of these words. And this is what they need for their job, not to have conversations, but to be able to have the right words for all the parts. And it's been extremely useful.
That's great. Yeah, images are great, aren't they? Thanks so much. That's fantastic. Lydia's saying photos and flashcards and personalize and relate the content to the students. Brilliant. So Lydia, I particularly like your second point, but would you like to elaborate very quickly on your points?
Yes, I just like to use photos. I use my own images or photos just to relate to the students, and then they can show their own photos as well. It just helps them to, it provides more of a context and helps them to remember the words or phrases, and it helps them to memorize. Okay,
and do you when you say you get them to use photos from their own context, so how do you do that?
So at the moment I'm teaching young learners, and so they're in their house, so I'll show a photo, and then usually they're in the living room, and then they'll have photos nearby. So it's usually just things what they can see in their room.
Because they're already at home, so they actually have access to this stuff straight away. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I totally agree with you that personalization is very strong. Well, for learning at all, like for every sort of corner of learning, but with photographs it really I think that's a great point.
When you can relate it to yourself, it just helps it to stick in your head for longer.
Yes, absolutely. Cool, great, thanks Lydia, that's cool. Moving on. Okay,
Gabi mentioned that she uses photos with lower level students, and that's interesting because I think probably we can ask her as well.
Yes, okay, let's move on to Gabi's
her
question.
Experience as well.
Yes.
Hi Gabriel. Hi Hedy. Right, okay, before I ask you, or before I talk about low level students, I have something else I want to talk about. Now, this is not really, it's not a question, Gabriel, so don't feel kind of pressured to answer. It's more of a reflection, because when I was watching the video, at some point something hit me. And that was when you asked us to come up with images to elicit some words like a crane and to drown, okay? So the moment I kind of put my mind to it, and I started thinking of the best image, and then I felt like, right, okay, but what's the difference between using images for elicitation purposes and using images to aid recall and vocabulary retention? Because I feel like these are two different things.
Yes, totally.
Simply because, you see, when I thought of the word to drown, I immediately felt like the easiest way to elicit is by showing, to elicit this word, this particular one, is by showing them a picture of someone who is drowning, right? I mean, This is how you kind of make sure that the concept is clear to students. So why would I be using a bizarre and unorthodox image to elicit a piece of vocabulary? So that makes me think perhaps there are kind of two different purposes of using images in the classroom. So there's one when you elicit vocabulary, and then there is another one, you use images later to help students remember the word. And this is when students make those crazy associations, right?
Absolutely.
But I simply wouldn't go for, like, when I teach vocabulary, I wouldn't start with crazy images. I don't know why. I'm just uneasy about doing it. Even, you know, your example with teaching coal when you showed the snowman, okay? Again, my immediate thought was, if you presented this vocabulary, this lexis, to me using this image, my immediate association would have been stones. So, because when I was a kid, I used stones instead of coal, okay? So now, then the question is, if this is the image I am developing in my head, because you used the image of the snowman, then clearly I'm getting the wrong concept, right?
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if you understand what I'm getting at. I'm just trying to make a point of when should we use bizarre images? At what stage in the lesson? Because, and don't get me wrong, because I absolutely love what you are talking about in the video. So I absolutely love the concept. I love crazy images. My only question is, at what stage do we use those images? At the teaching stage or later to help students remember?
Okay, cool. Yeah, this is a really good question. I would say there are 3 stages, actually, and the third one I haven't addressed today. So yeah, I think it's really good that you're making a distinction between elicitation, images for elicitation, the images for introduction of vocabulary, and images for helping learners remember words, because these are very different things, aren't they? And yes, I think this clarity and impact thing. I mean, perhaps you're right. I think you might be making a really good point about the snowman. Who uses coal on the snowman anymore? I hadn't really thought about that until now. But generally speaking, this clarity and impact combination is very particularly useful for when you're sort of introducing vocabulary or eliciting vocabulary. And I think that's like the first stage. Then when it comes to remembering vocabulary, when students are perhaps studying and trying to learn, like increase their vocabulary sort of actively, that's when the weird stuff can really help. They already know what the word is and the concept is, but they can't remember the word, or they're still trying to get that into their long-term memory. So that's when the aid of some crazy dragon with a pie on its head or whatever can really help cement.
Yeah, I have to say that's how I feel about it, because I mean, I'd love to be I mean, as a non-native speaker, I'd love to, you know, have been taught vocabulary this way. But yeah, it does take a lot of creativity on the teacher's part as well, because it's not easy to come up with these images, right? I mean, your images are brilliant, but then you seem to have the gift, right? But you see, I struggled to see this connection between drown and crown, right? How do I make this connection? So it's kind of tricky. I mean, I don't know how other teachers feel about it, but I mean, I love the idea. Okay, I really love it. It's just that it's extremely tough. It's difficult to
I think so. Yes, and can I address that very brief, like after a very brief final point about the third stage. So yeah, first elicitation, impact and clarity. Second, memory hooks and weird things. But then as this stuff enters your like active vocabulary and you start using it, you don't need that memory hook anymore. So, you know, when I use certain words, I can't think of any examples right now because I'm on the spot, but when I use certain words in Bulgarian, language I'm learning, that I used to have a memory hook for, I don't use the memory hook anymore, because hopefully the memory hook becomes obsolete. The image that you've created to remember the word becomes obsolete because it becomes a much more automatic word, and you associate it with the meaning instead of the image. But oh God, I completely forgotten your last point. You had a very good point.
We had 2 points. One was elicitation versus retention or recall, and another one was it's difficult to create those images.
Okay, about that, yes. So yes, with okay, so this is a skill, right? Basically, I think the more you do it, the better you get at it. You don't necessarily have to be crazily creative either. I mean, I found this in my own experience because I've sort of taken the time aside and tried to train my students to use this memory technique, this keyword method. And yeah, I always see the same thing. It's a bit tricky at the beginning, but you spend like a good session. If you have the time to do that, it's great. Like you can spend a whole session just working on it and coming up with more and more examples. And it does get easier. It just simply gets easier. And nothing's 100%, but I've tried this on lots and lots and lots of students, and most of them have responded really well and enjoyed it as well.
I can just, sorry, I'm just looking at Lydia's comment, a crown which is drowning. I mean, this is beautiful. You see, like, how come she got it just like that, Lydia? You got it like that. And it took me, I don't know how long, and I still couldn't get it.
I think it's like a skill, Gabi. So, when you do something for the first time, it's really difficult and it makes you think. But the more time you spend on, doing this, then you just kind of get the hang of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Gabriel
It's just a little bit of practice and just like building new habits, So at the beginning, it's challenging, it's difficult, and then they just become a little bit less challenging.
But do you feel, I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel like this is not only applicable to images, because essentially what you're saying, Gabriel, is that it just has to be something that's totally bizarre and totally unorthodox. It doesn't have to be an image. It could be a crazy scenario, a crazy anecdote, a crazy association that the teacher is making, kind of out loud in the classroom. So anything that is not just regular thinking, but a crazy image or a mental image, if you will. It doesn't have to be a visual, right?
Well, I mean, the stuff I looked into and the research I've done on this was just focused on images, because it's the whole Pavlov's dual coding stuff and Atkinson's research, which was 100% sort of visually image based. I can only speak from personal experience, which hasn't really worked so well for me, thinking of scenarios and so on, because I've always found that if you've got a scenario with someone does something, then someone else does something, and there's like a chain of events, and it's no longer static, that's when things can get elaborate. And I think it becomes taxing on the brain. It becomes too taxing on the brain, because the whole point of using the images is to make like kind of shortcuts and hacks and trying to reduce the strain on the cognitive strain to reach the marriage of this form and this meaning. But I haven't done the research on that. This is just my own personal experience. So it may be quite possible for other people to be able to do that well.
Yeah, it's these techniques are often used in mindfulness as well, and the idea behind this to create images that are out of the ordinary, because when you see or hear of something that you are not used to, you remember those more. So it's like you trick your brain in a sense with this. So that's the idea behind that. And Bartolo may have something to add as well.
Okay, yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Hey, Gabriel.
Hi.
Thank you. Very, very nice workshop. I really enjoyed it. By the way, I'm a huge fan of your podcast. I was listening to it.
Okay, thanks so much. That's great to hear.
So it's not really a question. I just wanted to bring up my experience with using this technique, and I wanted to say that it works also on our native language. So I'm Italian, I'm a foreigner, and I used this technique at school when I had to learn poems. So we had to learn very long poems, and what my classmates did was repeating word by word. So they repeat word 1, and then word 1 and 2, and then 1, 2, and 3, and so on. While I invented a new method that was drawing the words, word by word, just drawing. And at a certain point, I had to be very fast. So my drawings started being simplified, more and more simplified, until they were a sort of ideograms that I was the only one to understand. And in this way, I was able to learn very long poems in a very, very short period of time. And I noticed that I remembered them for a longer period of time compared to my classmates. So
that's interesting. So you created images that you kind of condensed into like almost a sort of letter or symbol.
Yes, so if you take any poem or you open a book and you just start drawing word by word a sentence, and at a certain point you have to be fast. So at the beginnings you take care of every single detail while you are drawing. But at a certain point, because you have to be very fast, you start simplifying a lot. And using this technique, you are able to remember just by reading your drawings and then leaving your drawings, you're able to learn long pieces of content in a very short period of time.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that this sort of stuff is used a lot in sort of memory championships, these big competitions where people are remembering like a whole deck of cards and stuff like that, and they use sort of similar kinds of techniques. So it sounds like you should probably apply for one of those, Bartolo. Who had a question? Isaivani, did you have a question?
It was just regarding what the lady was saying before. I can't remember her name. I think it was Gabby. With regards to the word crazy, I mean, this is so personal. You have to really look at the situation you're in, understand the culture of the classroom, the culture of the country in. So what may seem crazy to me may not be to them, and the other way around. So I think also, as you said, it's not about me trying to conjure up crazy images to help it stick. It's about showing them how to do it themselves and maybe asking them to offer, an image that they think would help them remember the word. So I don't think it's necessary that we have to have these skills beforehand. We go with what we think would work, we try it out, and we see how it goes. And if it doesn't work, we get them to help us. And in this way, images can be very useful, in my opinion.
Yes, I totally agree. Yeah, I think the best ones are the ones that people come up with for themselves, because everyone's brain works a little differently from everybody else's, and what works well for one person won't work so well from another. And as you mentioned, cultural differences as well as individual differences, all of these differences and types of differences are going to factor in to what works well. Yeah, I totally agree. It's always tempting for the teacher to kind of create one themselves, because we all want to help. That's probably why we're all teachers. And but yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. If they can do it themselves, if you can encourage the students to get into the habit and to develop the skills of creating their own, then it's much more valuable.
But that only means that these images are not really used for elicitation purposes, right? So that in a sense reinforces my point.
Yes, I want to differentiate once more about the type of images for elicitation and the type of images for memorization. So the key word, when I was talking about getting the students to create their own, I was referring to the keyword method images. So the ones used in order to try and get the new vocabulary into the long-term memory, not the ones to introduce to the students at the beginning for their first exposure to it.
Yeah, that's clear. That's clear.
Yeah. I think you're right to make sure that's clear, because that you wouldn't want to use the keyword method to elicit new vocabulary. I think that is a very good point to be made.
Yeah, I mean, if only because, say, if you observe somebody's lesson and then this is the way new vocabulary is elicited, then I don't really think you would pass a lesson like that.
Oh, in a formal observation.
Yeah, see what I'm saying? So,
yes.
As much as I absolutely love your ideas, I really do. It's just that I would never ever use kind of, I don't know, ambiguous images to elicit concepts when I know that students are not familiar with the concept, if you know what I mean. So,
no, that's why I say impact and clarity. These two things they cannot be ambiguous if you're introducing. I totally agree. Yeah.
I also love the idea, Gabriel, where you mentioned it during your presentation that you spent a session with your students trying to train them to use whatever method you've found appropriate. And this is about like learning strategies, because very often students hear about certain strategies, but they are rarely taught how to use them. And so they do not have techniques or methods or approaches to memorize lexical items, for instance.
Yes, and it's sometimes, you know, some people have been brought up with, you know, just like the educated with quite sort of let's say research, outdated according to research methods, you know, simply like learning lists and so on, and things that have basically been shown not to be very effective. So giving them a tool, especially a fun tool, because that also motivates them, I think it's valuable. It's really valuable for them. Yeah.
Or various tools, not just one, various, and because we are all weird, we are all unique.
Yes.
And, you know, so listing may work for some.
I will agree. Yeah, I will agree. I'm referring to broad research that I haven't looked into enough for this session. But yes, I'm with you on that. Shall I take another question? There are a few points in the chat that I could address. Because I think I missed one from Rachel, who says that it's easier for her students, she thinks it's easier if students use memory hooks in their first language. I'm going to read this out because it's kind of fun. For example, gatal in Indonesian, it means to itch, feel itchy. I learned this word by imagining Al Pacino scratching himself whilst leaning against a gate. Gatal. Oh, Al. Yeah, gatal. Okay. This is a great example. And I think we already covered whether you use L1 or L2. Like, again, whatever works best for the student is usually the final answer on these. So
I have a question, Gabriel.
Oh, yes. Again. No, please do.
This is a really kind of light-hearted question, but I'm just curious. Like, when did you get interested in using this method? I mean, how did it all start? What inspired you?
It was from learning Russian.
So it was what you talked about in the video, right?
Yes, yeah. Yes, I guess that was the first time I'd really come across it. And
when you started using it in the classroom, you yourself, with your students, do you remember any kind of major disasters using images? Like something... a little anecdote, like something that backfired in a sense, like you wanted to use a particular image, and then it's just to show us that sometimes you have to be careful.
I agree that you always have to be careful, because misunderstandings can. I'm sure it's happened to me, but I can't remember any examples. So, well, yes, maybe I've just blanked it from my memory. I don't know, but. It can't mean anything too disastrous, I think. But I'm sure from time to time, I think what can happen, and it still happens to me a lot, and it's something that needs to, you sort of need to be aware of, is that you can get your memory hooks confused. You can get them mixed up. You can have a memory hook for one word, and then the time comes to recall that word, and you end up using a memory hook from another word. If that makes sense. Yeah. And like I said in the workshop, like, not all of them work well for, not all vocabulary lends themselves to memory hooks. Some things you do need to get a little bit elaborate, and I guess that's when to use your word, disaster can strike, and you can end up coming out with the wrong thing.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. And finally, one from Lydia. How many memory hooks would you use per lesson? I think it's a good question, but I think that completely depends on what you're teaching and what content your lesson is. Whether you're teaching lots of new vocabulary, whether you're revisiting old vocabulary, and yeah, I think that is completely up to the intuition of a teacher. In my experience, I don't know. Sometimes I have sort of vocabulary sessions where we do a lot of vocabulary review, and if I feel that a student is having trouble with vocab during review, that's when they crop up the most. But generally speaking, I think this is probably most valuable as something for students to be able to do themselves and in their own time. This is a self-study skill. This is a skill that they can take away and bring to like their general language learning development. So I suppose not very often during the lesson, once my students are already familiar with it.